In the spring of 1963, an Alabama judge issued an injunction banning all protests against segregation in the city of Birmingham. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. chose to lead a protest anyway, and he was arrested for violating that injunction. He spent 8 days in jail before being released on bail, and this was just a couple of weeks before the children of Birmingham marched. While King was in jail, 8 local white ministers wrote and published a statement entitled, "A Call for Unity." They said they agreed that segregation was a problem, but the way King was trying to address it was all wrong. That he should argue his case in court, not march in the streets. That he was an outsider stirring up trouble, creating tension and violence where before there had been none. That he shouldn't break the law. And it just wasn't the right time to raise these issues. In their view, the protests should end and King should leave town. I've heard every one of those objections in modern times. Every one of them, practically word for word. While in prison, King wrote a response that has become known as his Letter from Birmingham Jail. Parts of it were written on the margins of newspapers, the only paper he was permitted to have in his cell at first. It was written in pieces that had to be fit back together when it was done. The New York Times chose not to publish it, but others soon did. The first was the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, in May of 1963. King began by expressing his love and respect for his colleagues, and then he took their arguments apart one by one. The ex-lawyer in me loves this letter. He talked about how civil disobedience is in the Bible and in history. Quoting St. Augustine, he said that an unjust law is no law at all. And he went on to unpack what that meant in practice and the responsibilities and implications for those who choose to ignore an unjust law. That isn't my topic for today, but it's excellent reading, and Nellson will share some thoughts in a few minutes. In response to complaints about timing, he famously said, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." Frankly, he went on, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. This wait has almost always meant never. Justice too long delayed is justice denied. Nellson will come back to this piece shortly as well. My focus for today is on his answer to the charge that the demonstrations were causing tension. King said, "We who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive." And he continued, "You deplore the demonstrations, but your statement, I'm sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations." I did say that his words speak to our time too. King is remembered today as a man of peace, and I'm pretty sure he would agree with that characterization. But he had some very clear ideas about what that meant and what it did not mean. What the white clergy thought of as peace was maintaining the status quo, where it was possible, from their vantage point, to overlook the existing tension and violence of oppression. But in his response, King made a distinction between what he called a negative peace, which is the absence of visible tension, and a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. The peace King sought was that positive peace. For him, nonviolence meant not initiating violence, but also deliberately disrupting injustice in the pursuit of positive peace, even if doing so led to more visible tension, even if resistance to that disruption showed up as violence. And he expressed his disappointment that the white moderates and clergy that he originally thought would be allies in this work seemed to be stuck insisting on negative peace. In fact, he referred to them as a greater stumbling block than the Ku Klux Klan, because they were people who were, in his words, more devoted to order than to justice, who constantly say, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically set the timetable for another man's freedom. And he goes on, shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. And he had particularly harsh words for the white church and its leadership, who he described as more cautious than courageous, remaining silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. King spoke metaphorically of stained glass windows, but they can be literal as well. Episcopal priest Kelly Brown Douglas is currently, among other roles, the canon theologian at the Washington National Cathedral. She tells a story about two stained glass windows in that cathedral, one honoring Robert E. Lee and the other Stonewall Jackson, both displayed as though they were saints and even including a Confederate flag. These windows were installed in 1953 as part of the larger effort of the time to create public displays of Confederate symbols and heroes. They were intended to convey a sacredness, to align these figures with the holy, permanently enshrined in our history and consciousness, with the clear implication that, in Douglas's words, God is a white supremacist. For more than 60 years, they remained there, a bit of glorified white supremacy embedded in a religious community that professed a commitment to justice. And that commitment and that community remained silent about the presence of those windows because speaking of them, and perhaps removing them, would disrupt and divide the community. It was, in Douglas's words, a peace that privileged harmony. It was King's negative peace. But in 2015, the congregation began to openly discuss the windows. It was indeed divisive. It surfaced tension. There was resistance to having the conversation. Some people even left the community. But through this tension, more of the white congregants were finally able to hear, Douglas said, the way in which Black people viewed the windows as an affirmation of an ideology that denied their sacred humanity. Those who experienced less oppression listened to and were led by those who experienced more. And the community chose to accept the disruption and tension, and even the loss of some members, in pursuit of the positive peace that is justice. The windows were removed in 2017. New windows with racial justice themes were dedicated 2 years ago. I chose to share that story because the image of the light that illuminates the congregation shining through Confederate stained glass windows has some power to it. But I didn't have to go into another faith tradition to find an embedded oppression that goes unnoticed by many and that is painful to uproot. Ours, too, has ways of privileging harmony out of fear, conflict avoidance, or obliviousness. And ours, too, is learning to strive instead for the peace that flows from justice. Just as when King wrote this letter, and when the cathedral's congregation considered those windows, what it takes is a willingness on the part of those who experience less oppression to listen to and follow the leadership of those who experience more. To be careful about critiquing and distancing from actions that surface the tensions and violence of oppression. The clergy who wrote the call for unity spoke the words of anti-segregation, but landed on the wrong side of history because they were stuck behind their stained glass windows, illuminating a world that prioritized harmony over justice. The oppression embedded in the windows that illuminate our worldview may be less obvious than when it comes in actual stained glass, but it's with us. Our task is to recognize and then remove those windows. This is our eighth principle work, and it's work we do with each other when we find the humility to listen and learn and follow the leadership of someone who experiences a particular oppression more deeply. It's work our inclusivity team is bringing to the wider congregation, and I hope we will all participate with open minds and hearts as invited. And it's work we're doing out in the world when we support those most affected by the oppression of our government today. It's work, but we have each other, and together it is work we can do. Back in 1963, King brilliantly articulated these ideas for a world that was largely not ready to hear them, that chose instead to focus on a dream and the privileging of harmony. As we honor his teachings in this congregation and in our lives, may we choose to hear more of the fullness of his message. And may we, more and more, dismantle the windows of oppression that illuminate our perspective and keep moving toward the positive peace that flows from justice. May it be so. Amen.
Like the Emancipation Proclamation, I had never actually read the entire letter from Birmingham jail until Reverend Ann presented it as our platform for today's service. Until now, I was unaware that the genesis of the letter was Dr. King rebuking his religious colleagues. Reading several passages for the first time gave me a deeper understanding of Dr. King's values. He had a strong dislike for hypocrisy, both in others and within himself, and expressed clear dissatisfaction with procrastination. Many of his religious peers objected to civil rights activists breaking laws by actions such as sitting at segregated counters or drinking from segregated water fountains. Dr. King's powerful response was, "An unjust law is no law." This statement immediately brought to mind the reality of businesses lawfully refusing services to certain citizens. I was reminded of my travels through South Carolina and Georgia on my honeymoon, thinking, two men with matching wedding rings are going to encounter some issues. Fortunately, we did not. However, the existence of such laws in our country has directly impacted my daughter's safety, mental well-being, especially amid the hysteria over forcing trans Americans to use restrooms corresponding to their gender at birth. My daughter is 6 feet tall, slender as a rail with fabulous cheekbones, big, beautiful eyes, and naturally long lashes. I can only imagine the harassment she might endure if she were forced to enter a men's restroom. This concept terrifies her. And through her experiences, I am beginning to understand truly how terrified my mother was when she found 7-year-old me having a Coke at the Greyhound Terminal Cafe in 1965, segregated Richmond, Virginia. These laws were and are real. Similarly, can you imagine the reaction if my extremely muscular soldier ex-chorus mate, who now sports a full beard and mustache, walked into the ladies' room? The reality is that we all have family, friends, and coworkers who break these kinds of laws every day. The laws make no practical sense, and they only serve to make people feel less than. Another passage from Dr. King's letter that resonated with me was his statement that justice delayed is justice denied. Dr. King's religious colleagues urged him and his followers to be patient. And history has showed us the consequences of delayed justice. The Emancipation Proclamation took 2 years to only be partially enforced. At that time, Mississippi and South Carolina had majority African American populations. While the Union Army occupied those states, formerly enslaved men were allowed to vote, resulting in Mississippi having 2 African American United States senators and a congressman. And South Carolina was represented by 7 congressmen of African descent. Ironically, in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act passed, Mississippi and South Carolina had absolutely no African American representation in Washington, D.C., even though African American men and women could legally vote. The lack of federal enforcement allowed local governments to use violence and intimidation to discourage the majority population from voting, or better yet, move north. Mississippi has not had a U.S. senator of color since 1886. And as of 2026, has only 1 congressperson of color. South Carolina elected its first U.S. senator of color in 2013. Unfortunately, it is Tim Scott. And currently has only 1 congressperson of color. This legacy explains to me why my Southern relatives were less enthusiastic about voting and politics compared to those of us in the North. Years of segregationist and Jim Crow laws successfully broke the tradition of generational voting. Today, we are living in a time when federal representatives are publicly calling for the abolition of women's right to vote. Our national government is erasing the achievements of African, Hispanic, Asian, Latino, Muslim, LGBTQ, Indigenous, and female Americans from the nation's history. The president believes that he can order the military to follow any command that he gives, and he threatens members of Congress and the Senate with execution. We now face 2 urgent questions, my friends. Are we willing to break an unjust law to save our democracy? And how willing are we to force justice forward so that it cannot be denied? With all of that said, like Dr. King, I have an unwavering faith in the promise of justice. My belief is rooted in the conviction that nonviolent tension deliberately created through peaceful protest and civil disobedience can serve as a powerful catalyst for meaningful change. This approach, championed by Dr. King, demonstrates that progress is possible even in the face of great resistance. We must also recall that our very foundation of our nation is built upon the principle that sovereignty lies with its citizens. The phrase, "we the people," the opening words of the Constitution, signifies that the legitimacy of our government is derived from the will and collective action of its people. Although the Constitution is not without its imperfections, it was conceived with the intention of establishing a government accountable to those it serves. Dr. King's legacy is evident in his willingness to challenge not only his adversaries, but his peers. He confronted his colleagues in the pursuit of justice, advocating for the inclusion of Americans of African descent in the ongoing project of building a more perfect union, establishing justice, and securing peace for future generations. Na iwe hivo, amen.